I want to hop right into the teaching of the Scriptures this morning. Every time we get together, we think it's important to study what God has to tell us. And knowing we are having baptisms and a global outreach guest, I've kind of prepared accordingly. So let's dive right into my series, which I am calling Religiously Transmitted Diseases. The one that we are talking about today, well, first of all, before I introduce that, let me say this. Back in 2022, 2 years ago, there was a poll taken, a nationwide poll, on what people think about Christians. Can you imagine what the top three were? Number one, hypocritical. Number two, judgmental. And number three, self-righteous. Now we can say, well, that's not the way that I really am. Well, it's the way that Christian people as a whole are perceived. So I want to talk about the religiously transmitted disease of hypocrisy, since that was number one on the list. Now, and I want to talk about preventing it. The word hypocrisy in the language of the Bible comes out of the theater, actually, where you are playing a role. Some years ago, just before they got married, Caleb Turnage was playing the Beast in Beauty and the Beast in a production over in Fond du Lac, and he did an incredible job. I went to see that. But in his appearance, he looked like the Beast, and in his singing and in his acting, he was taking on himself a role that is not really who Caleb is. Caleb's a very, very different individual, but we could say that he was being a hypocrite in the biblical sense. Something that he really wasn't, that he was taking on. I want us to go to Matthew chapter 23, and it would be good for you to open your own Bible. I project the words behind us on the screen so that you can see it, but there's a couple of interesting things here for you to see as you look at it on your own. Matthew chapter 23, beginning at verse 1, it says, "Then Jesus said to the crowds and to the disciples," this is his first primary audience here. In verse 13, maybe it's verse 14, he's going to change his audience. But now he's talking to the crowds and the disciples, the large number of people. And he talks to them about the scribes and the Pharisees. Scribes were professional students and teachers of the law. Pharisees were a group of people who were dedicated to the scrupulous observance of the Old Testament legal law and legal traditions. Now, understand that Pharisees were a revival movement at one point in time. Their purpose was to say, God's people have wandered. We want to teach them God's ways. And to the point that they were willing to be very extreme in their own following of God's ways and trying to teach others this. I mean, they were people that were worthy of being looked up to and admired. They were God's best, if you will, when they started. What happened? How did they get to where Jesus spoke about them in the way that he is speaking about them in Matthew chapter 23? So he says the scribes and the Pharisees, they sit at Moses' seat. In other words, they're the teachers representing God. Verse 3, "So do and observe what they tell you, but not the works they do." That's like, do as I say, not as I do. For they preach, but they do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad. What is a phylactery? Another word for it is tefillin. Tefillin, I think, is the proper pronunciation of that. I want to show you a picture of a phylactery. It is a little box, leather, strapped around the head. They are obeying literally what God says in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 8. Take the word of God and put it on your forehead. And they would also then strap it on their arm. They had long straps, and it would be on their arm. They were doing literally what God said to do. He says, so they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. That's another thing that the religious people did. They love the place of honor at feasts and the best seats in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplaces and being called rabbi by others. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher and you are all brothers. And call no man your father on earth, for you have one Father who is in heaven. Neither be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Christ. The greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. These two things that Jesus required of his disciples are preventive measures of hypocrisy. And the two things are, in verse 11, serve. And in verse 12, humility. We're going to come back to that. Let's go on in verse 13. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you shut the kingdom of heaven in people's places, for you neither enter yourselves nor allow those who would enter to go in. I'm going to read verse 14. It's not projected up there because in many Bibles, the scholars believe that verse 14 probably shouldn't be there. So if you're following along in your own Bible, usually it'll skip from verse 13 to 15. You may notice that. But in verse 14, he says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense you make long prayers. Therefore you will receive the greater condemnation. Verse 15, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel across sea and land to make a single proselyte. And when he becomes a proselyte, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourselves. Holy cow. He's scorching these guys. Verse 16, woe to you, blind guides, who say, if anyone swears by the temple, it's nothing. But if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he is bound by the oath. You blind fools, for which is greater, the gold or the temple that has made the gold sacred? And you say, if anyone swears by the altar, it's nothing. But if anyone swears by the gift that's on the altar, he's bound by his oath. You blind men, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? So whoever swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it. Whoever swears by the temple swears by it and by him who dwells in it. And whoever swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by him who sits upon it. Verse 23, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides, straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel.